World Heritage Sites. Hello, I'm Richard Harwood. I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And I'm Clarissa Levi, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And we're delighted to have with us today Alexandra Warr, who is the Head of International Strategy at Historic England. And we're going to talk about World Heritage Sites, how they function and how that process operates. So hello, Alexandra.
Hello, Richard. Hello, Clarissa.
First of all, we're looking at the World Heritage Convention. Can you explain to us what the World Heritage Convention is and what it covers?
I think I would say that the 1972 convention is really a convention of hope. It was a rallying call, really, by the international community to come together at a time where, and I think it's in the preamble, where the magnitude and gravity of the threats to heritage needed that collective efforts for all peoples of the world to have these places protected for them. The official full title of the convention is the Convention Concerning the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage. And it's important that I mention that because it's the first time that really they brought cultural and natural heritage into a single conversation. Before then, it was really happening in the two separate spaces. And I think in essence, it's a testament to the idea that there are places shaped by mankind and by nature as well, that is so extraordinary that they should remain in existence so that our children and grandchildren and so on have the opportunity to marvel at them.
As a concept of outstanding universal value, hard to see how you could pitch anything higher than that, but what does that encompass? What meets that qualification? It's pretty high, isn't it?
It is. I think if you think of some of the sites that are inscribed on the list, you can think of Stonehenge, one which we're all familiar with, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt, the Jurassic Coast in Dorset and East Devon, Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, or even the Great Plains of the Serengeti. All of those are World Heritage Sites. But at the same time, you also have sites that are a little less well known internationally. So, for example, Iron Bridge Gorge perhaps is one that wouldn't immediately jump into your minds. Industrial heritage is not something that is as well recognized, if you like, as places like Stonehenge or Blenheim Palace.
It's interesting in terms, because I mean, the obvious British site is Stonehenge. It's on the front of all the books and so on. So many of those sites, the British sites, are industrial revolution. That reflecting a sense of what the UK's contribution to history has been as part of that is as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So throws in places like Derwent Valley and sites which are not sort of so bits of Derby in reality, sites which aren't actually quite so iconic.
Yes, I think that's right. I think the point about the outstanding universal value is that it takes a story, if you like. So I like to think of outstanding universal value as really a story that places tell. And quite often at the national level, we have our own stories that we recognize through the listing system, through the monuments protection systems. What World Heritage does is looks across the whole world and looks at those stories that only exist within those places. So at the national level, for example, an industrial heritage site may be quite common, but actually at the international level, this is something which is quite rare.
And there are, I think it's now 1,248 properties on the list, and it keeps being added to year by year. Is the standard changing in terms of what gets put on the list?
I think the difficulty with the list is that I don't think our forefathers could have foreseen the success of the World Heritage Convention and, by extension, the World Heritage List. When it was first created in 1972, they could not have imagined that there would be 1,248 sites across 170 different states parties. That's an enormous number. I think what's happened in the 50 years or so since the convention was first created is that there has been a very big shift in how heritage protection is seen. So I think in that sense, the difficulty is that we have a lot of sites that are being looked after at the national level through lots of different protection systems, but still sitting underneath this wider convention, which carries its own conservation philosophy.
What's that sort of conservation philosophy? How do we, under the convention, deal with these sites in terms of what should their future be? How do we preserve outstanding universal value?
What I'm most interested in as well is that tension always between looking after an undeniably important site, but also kind of allowing human life to flourish, which means allowing development. And I'm fascinated to know how that's permitted.
So I think I've got to go back, actually, if I may. And I think it's worth looking at where the World Heritage Convention really came from. And it was really born out of that national and international movements for protecting heritage after World War I. So the same drivers that created our national heritage protection system, or really the lists, if you like, were the same drivers that created UNESCO and the listing process. So UNESCO itself was formed in 1942 to promote peace with the idea of preventing another outbreak of war. And the catalyst for the World Heritage List really came when the United Arab Republic started construction on a new dam along the River Nile outside Aswan. So this is a well-known case. And the dam was really being proposed to improve irrigation across the region. But to do so, it would flood the valley and the 13th century Great Temple of Abu Simbel, which has these incredible carvings, these hieroglyphs depicting the feats of Ramses II. So that would be lost. So what UNESCO did, and this was before the World Heritage Convention, before the World Heritage List, they created this international rescue effort, which was called the Nubia Campaign. So this was in November of 1963. They brought together a group of international hydrologists and engineers and archaeologists, a whole load of professionals under the UNESCO umbrella for a multi-year plan that was going to see the breakdown of the two temples and cutting them into precise blocks and then essentially relocating them 60 meters above their original location, but also cleverly recreating the same solar alignment. So that was completed in 1968. Venice was then flooded more or less the same time. And so UNESCO rallied again. And in the parallel, in 1965, there was a big conference in the US in Washington where they called for the creation of a World Heritage Trust with the idea of preserving these kind of natural and scenic places and historic sites. So it was all of this. So it was the threat of loss. It was development that was pressuring onto these heritage sites that actually created this movement in the international community that said, we need something that is going to allow us as individual countries to say how much we feel that heritage places are important, not just to ourselves, but to the whole of humanity. And really, so to your question, Clarissa, around the pressures between developmental tensions between development and heritage protection, those are the things that created the World Heritage List in the very first place. So they've always existed.
And in terms of taking it forward and any balance, are the sites seen as sites to be preserved sort of as they are, or to what extent the sites evolve? I mean, some of those are some very natural sites, some are historic city centres. How do we look at that sort of balance which we've mentioned?
So I think the convention itself really is, as I said at the beginning, it's really a document that holds within it a broad concept to which everybody agrees, i.e., these are really wonderful places and they should be kept for all time. The way that that is implemented in practice, because as you will know, an international convention is not binding at the national level in law. Principles have to be drawn down and placed into international legislation. So the way that that is governed by UNESCO itself is through their operational guidelines, which give, in a sense, the lead for how those should be implemented and what the duties under the convention could or should be. Now, the challenge, I think, with the operational guidelines is that those are continuously revised. Now, rightly so, the revisions are sensible, but there have been 29 revisions of the operational guidelines since 1977. So when in 1977, the operational guidelines had 28 paragraphs, by 2024, there are 290. So the rules, if you like, which govern the implementation or the expectations, let's say, of what should be done at the state party level for the implementation of the convention have grown from 28 guiding principles to 290 paragraphs of quote rules. That in and of itself, I think, provides a bit of a challenge, particularly for sites that were inscribed early on, where at the origin, sites were, a monument. The idea of setting and boundaries and all of this have extended massively since 1972. And in our case, our first inscriptions were in, 1986.
And is that changing the philosophy again, to go back to that? Or is it just adding detail to what can and can't be done?
It sounds like I'm slightly hedging around the answer, but I'm not. I think that the complexity is that these are documents written so that 196 different countries with different rules, different planning legislations can find a way to integrate into their national law. So within the convention and the operational guidelines, they are much tighter in terms of what is or isn't, quote, permitted. I think that within the convention, it does say that the states parties should do their utmost. So there are words, but again, going back to the 196 different states parties, bear in mind, obviously, that we read the convention in English, and we are English people reading an English written document, but the interpretation of different words can also be different. So utmost in one context could really mean as you try as hard as you can. Utmost in another context could mean you have to do the maths full stop. So, and that's a slightly different take on the same word.
Yes, it's a question what it means, also then how you apply it. And someone asked about one matter which, Alexandra, which we were both involved with, which was Stonehenge, where, just for purpose of disclosure, I was acting for Historic England in the various bits of litigation about the Stonehenge road tunnel. What were the issues? What was the balancing exercise in that matter?
So within our national protection system, we do have the planning balance. This is the crux of the difference, I suppose, between the national heritage protection system and the kind of convention's consideration of heritage protection. And that was, I suppose, where the interpretation of the text really came under scrutiny. And I think, you'll know better the outcome of the case and how that was interpreted by the judges.
Yes, because it was concerned with the proposal for a road tunnel to run through and in part under the World Heritage Site, which had on one side the benefit of removing the surface level A303 traffic. And anyone who's been down the A303 would have seen the Stone Circle and the Stonehenge environment from that. And anyone who's gone to the Stone Circle will have seen and heard the traffic thundering not too far away. It's the benefits of a faster route and the impacts of putting the tunnel in. So the view which both Historic England had taken and actually the government was that the convention did allow a balance to be struck. And in case known as Stonehenge 2, it sounds like it should be an Aardman animation film. Stonehenge 2, the Court of Appeal agreed that there was a balance that could be struck. Protecting the utmost didn't raise the World Heritage Site as an overriding consideration. It's clearly incredibly important, but it doesn't mean that you can't say that the benefits of doing something else justify potentially some harm to it. But I think that sense of a balance is probably fairly well understood. How you then apply it in particular cases is obviously going to depend on circumstances, be potentially contentious.
Can I jump in with a question for you, Richard? What was being proposed and what was each side arguing, just in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, the proposal was to replace the sort of the surface level road, the A303, which is sort of the way from London to the West Country, with a dual carriageway, most of which would be within the World Heritage Site and in tunnel, although some parts would be out of a tunnel. Another consequence of that was also going to be reconstructing the road junctions, so just outside the World Heritage Sites.
And was the purpose of that to protect Stonehenge from vibrations?
Well, twofold. I think one is that it's been recognised that one of the problems of the Stonehenge site is it's got big roads running through it, one of which has been removed, and the other one is the 303. And so that's a visual impact, that's an impact on the ground, it's noisy, and so on. The other is it's also quite a bottleneck for traffic because it's sort of one lane each way, and lots of drivers slow down when they see the stone circles. So there were two rationales for it, but the question then how you resolve that problem of the traffic disturbing the World Heritage Site, and is the solution put forward better? And the alternative approach generally being put forward as being a longer tunnel in that context. So I think those are sort of really the issues being debated.
And the outcome?
I think it was rather odd outcome, was because it had been initially, I mean, the debate has been going on for decades. The scheme had been approved and then quashed by the High Court in 2021 because the minister hadn't looked at alternatives properly in terms of a longer road tunnel. And then the minister redetermined and approved it. And that decision was ultimately upheld by both the High Court and then the Court of Appeal. But in the meantime, the incoming government decided not to proceed with the project. So there's a consent for a road tunnel, but a government view not to proceed with it. So I suppose at some point we're all going to have to come back to what to do with Stonehenge.
Actually, Stonehenge was a fascinating case from the international side as well. I think because the existing road was recognized at the time of inscription in 1986 as something that was a negative impact on the integrity of the World Heritage Site. So here is a proposal which had been through umpteen different iterations across 50 years almost. It really was decades of work to come up with a scheme where everybody was more or less on the same page. And that in and of itself was quite a feat. From the advisory body, so ICOMOS, which is the International Council of Monuments and Sites, which is one of the World Heritage Committee's advisory bodies, really for cultural World Heritage sites. Their view was that particularly the impact of the Western portal, but it was really the Western portal that was causing the World Heritage Committee, advised by ICOMOS, to consider that this might be something that would cause the World Heritage Site to be placed on the World Heritage list of World Heritage in danger. But what was interesting about that is that you're talking about a very small area. And as part of the advice from the advisory mission, which came the year before, they had argued that what they would like to see for the Western portal was for it to be essentially a cut and cover, or that it had to be all the way outside of the World Heritage Site, but that it shouldn't be open. In UNESCO terms, that was the issue, was the fact that you had an open cutting on the western end of the scheme. And that idea was a bit challenging, really, for us. So bear in mind, at the national level, nobody was against the proposal. We had all run through it. So all the national partners had gone through it. So Historic England, National Trust, et cetera, et cetera. But they were saying that a cut and cover would mean that actually it wouldn't go on the list of World Heritage in danger, which by association suggests that the archaeological impact, what they were concerned about was the visual impact. And when it went to the committee and there were the debates when the decision was opened, the committee eventually agreed that this would not constitute a risk that would be high enough to mean that it would be placed on the list of World Heritage in danger.
To just bring together who's who in terms of how the convention operates at the international level, first of all, who are the World Heritage Committee?
So the World Heritage Committee are 21 rotating member states, so states parties, who are elected to represent the 196 states parties to the convention.
So we've got the states, and is it the World Heritage Committee making the decisions? And then who advises them? In terms of who's advising, and in a sense, who's got the influence, who's got the power in decision making? Who's there?
So the World Heritage Convention is governed by the General Assembly, which is made up of the 196 states parties to date. The 196 states parties during the General Assembly will elect 21 of their members to the World Heritage Committee, which then is the committee. It's like the working committee that will review the states of conservation and will also be charged with inscribing new sites every year. So they are in many ways, because 196 is unwieldy, the World Heritage Committee essentially represents the states parties and does the work on their behalf. The World Heritage Committee are supported by a secretariat, which is colloquially known as the World Heritage Centre. So that those are UNESCO staff members who will support the World Heritage Committee in their work on the day-to-day level and in between those annual World Heritage Committee meetings. The World Heritage Committee is then advised by 3 advisory bodies, and this is all within the convention, actually. ICOMOS, which is the International Council of Monuments and Sites, will provide the advice on the cultural World Heritage sites. IUCN will provide the advice on natural sites, and ICROM provides that capacity building function. So they do a lot of the training and capacity building for World Heritage.
So we have sort of decision-making sort of year by year taken by the World Heritage Committee. We're familiar in different contexts with the relationship between politicians and how far the politicians will follow the advice and so on. How far does the World Heritage Committee adopt the views of which ICOMOS and the World Heritage Centre are putting to it, or how far is that relationship rather more complex?
The relationship is rather more complex. I think, it's been quite well documented that there's been politicization, if you like, of UNESCO space. So I think there was a recognized shift from about 2010 onwards, where recommendations being made by the advisory bodies on both sides of the house, so in relation to new nominations, but also in relation to states of conservation, were being maybe not followed in the way that you would expect. And I think that that shift, if you like, towards the committee making decisions that varied from the recommendations of the advisory bodies coincides with delegations attending the World Heritage Committee meetings having a greater representation by, let's say, diplomats and foreign office. And that came for a very good reason, to be frank, because the convention itself says that the representative from the states party should be a technical person, so with competence in the field of archaeology, art history, architecture, and so on. But the reality of heritage, as we know, is that it is inherently political. And over the years, there have been a number of difficulties that have arisen from decisions made purely on that technical basis. And I think there's a need for a balanced representation so that you can take into consideration the more politically sensitive spaces, but also the technical side as well.
So how does the state parties, let's take our example of the UK, interrelate with the World Heritage Committee and the bodies? How do you deal with them? So
the UK has decided that the arguments, if you like, that we would make will be based on technical reasons. So if a draft decision in relation to a state of conservation, for example, comes out which is incorrect for a technical reason, that's the basis on which the UK as a state party would seek to challenge or change a draft decision. That's not always the case with other places. I think the pressure on inscriptions at a national level is very, very high. And national governments are under pressure from local governments who are themselves under pressure from the local people who have invested huge amounts of time and resource into seeing potential new World Heritage Site being inscribed. So there's a lot of energy on new inscriptions. So if the advisory bodies come back and say it's not ready or it needs a little more time, that's not something that's always comfortable for a state party, at which point they might seek to get the other committee members to inscribe it against the advice of the advisory bodies.
We pulled out some of the figures when we were dealing with Stonehenge. The tendency of those was that if the advisory bodies recommended the inscription, adding a place to the list, that was invariably agreed by the committee. If the advisory bodies said, actually, more work needs to be done or it doesn't meet that, quite a lot of cases, the committee would disagree and would inscribe.
Your words, not mine.
Okay. I think they're now producing an annual report as to how often the advisory bodies gets turned down.
And will they say why they get turned down? I mean, do places come forward saying, inscribe me, when they're just not beautiful or, up to whatever the standard is?
There are cases where sites have been evaluated as having no OUV that have been inscribed.
One thing we've touched on is the list of World Heritage in danger, and again, it's something that came up as a possibility in the Stonehenge litigation. What's the effect of that list? I mean, what does it mean and what are the consequences?
So the fascinating thing with the list of World Heritage in danger is that is the origin story of the World Heritage List. And the same, actually, for our own national lists. They were salvage lists. They weren't lists of lovely things. They were lists of places that were under potential threat and needed to be identified so that they could be looked after in the event they were actually demolished or threatened. So the World Heritage List really started as an exercise to identify places at the national level that could or should be protected in the event of something catastrophic happening. So really, that idea of in danger was at the heart of the convention. In the years since, the concept of in danger has become more of a name and shame rather than being something that is sought after because it would lead to international community awareness and potentially support. And there are ideas that have been floated around essentially a two-strand system for the list of World Heritage in danger, where you have one strand being sites that are recognized that are under threat because of something that is outside of the control of that individual country. So take climate change or things that are outside of their own control. But also, if there are challenges that they face at the national level where they simply don't have either the expertise or the resources to be able to deal with them, it's a place where they can put up their hands and go, we need a little help with this one. And the international community, possibly through the World Heritage Fund, which comes from UNESCO, can focus their support. And then a second strand where it's sites that are in danger because of actions undertaken by the state party itself and where the state party has got the possibility of rolling back the threat.
Like they have to build a dam, but they could build it in a different place.
For example.
One aspect of that is the sort of relationship between the World Heritage Committee and ICOMOS and their advisory bodies and what is going on with development schemes. The national guidance, planning policy guidance, says it would be very helpful if the Department for Culture, Media and Sport is told of schemes that may affect the World Heritage Sites, and Historic England are a consultee in most cases on those. But how does that work, given the World Heritage Committee meets once a year? How is development projects looked at that international level, given the pace at which things may be going on locally?
So this was one of the things that we looked at when I first took on the responsibility for World Heritage, so in 2021, was really recognizing that there was a challenge. We were operating between two systems that seemed to not overlap. So on the one hand, we had our national planning system, which is at pace, which has fixed timeframes and is working towards, achieving within that. And at the same time, with that planning balance concept within it. When it came to the World Heritage Sites, which were also at the national level, the timeframes were annual, if that. And at the international level, you have the challenge that you're being asked to consult with the advisory bodies and request technical review or send in what's called a paragraph 172 letter to notify the World Heritage Centre of a planned development with enough time for them to comment. In reality, there is no statutory time frame for them to comment. So there have been examples in the past where a 172 notification was submitted and a technical review was returned maybe a year later. That doesn't work within our national timeframes. We have been fortunate to be able to have a conversation with the World Heritage Centre and the advisory bodies, and we've agreed 12 to 16 week period within which we can expect to have a technical review returned. So we've, in a sense, managed to identify these two systems and a slight fudge of how we can try and pull these two very different systems together so that they can kind of work in compliance. And we've seen a few examples now where that's worked very successfully in practice. The most recent one, I suppose, was the Stonehenge Education Centre, which was notified actually during pre-application phase. So under confidentiality, there was the ability to have a confidential technical review on the proposals which were being made. By the time then the planning application was submitted, the applicant already knew that this was not going to cause any issues at the international level in relation to the World Heritage Site status, which in turn gave a degree of confidence, I suppose, to all the participants to be able to make the decisions they needed to make without potentially upsetting the World Heritage Site status for Stonehenge, Avebury and associated sites.
And the conversations between the state and ICOMOS and the World Heritage Centre, is that via Historic England? So the developers and the local authority would approach you, really, and then negotiations and discussions would happen?
So there is now a fairly set system, if you like, for exchanging information with UNESCO in relation to development. The state party for the UK is represented by DCMS, but the delegation when the UK goes to the committee is made up of our ambassadors, so our permanent delegation to UNESCO, DCMS as capital, and Historic England international team as the technical advice. So for that dialogue between UNESCO and the state party, it all flows through the delegation and DCMS. Historic England would provide that interlocutor, I suppose, between the local authority, the developers, and DCMS in providing that advice.
One final matter I want to come to is the question of delisting. We've discussed the list of World Heritage in danger, but the possibility of a property being taken off the list. That's only happened 3 times in the history of the convention. One of those was the Liverpool Maritime City, which was removed from the list a few years ago. Did that experience affect the way in which we're dealing with World Heritage sites and so on?
So I think for the UK, the delisting of Liverpool really was a catalyst, and the actual case itself was quite particular. So I think in terms of lessons learned and so on, it's so unique that actually I think it's difficult to draw too much from Liverpool itself. But it really was a catalyst for us at the national level and enabled us or encouraged us to look again at how we were implementing the convention at the national level, what provisions were in place, and what advice was available to colleagues, friends, partners at the national level. So since then, we have got a permanent delegate at UNESCO, our ambassador over there. We have functions within DCMS who are responsible for World Heritage. And within Historic England, we have created a lot more guidance and advice and providing training to both internal and external partners on World Heritage and what that means within the UK planning system. So one thing that's slightly unusual is that Historic England, obviously heritage is delegated in the UK, and Historic England really covers England only when it comes to the national designated assets. For World Heritage, we support the DCMS or the government across the whole of the UK. And so we engage very closely with our sister agencies across the UK and also the overseas territories. So we've been drawing together those links, improving that collaboration, I suppose, across all of those places, but also ensuring that everybody has the necessary information to be able to make the decisions they need to make.
And so does the system of the World Heritage Convention work? Does it help in heritage and protection of natural resources beyond what is done at the national level?
I would say absolutely. The World Heritage List, I think, remains incredibly popular. I don't know of any other convention that has 196 states parties that have signed up to it. It's an incredibly popular convention, and the list itself is seen as a gold standard, if you like. Now, that in itself causes issues because actually it's not just a gold plaque on the wall. It actually has teeth in that there are obligations and so on underneath it. But it's there, and it reminds us of how important heritage is to people. At the end of the day, historic places are places that people care about. And we can see that in our national legislation, in our national protection system. We can even see it in how many people go to a heritage place. There was a wonderful statistic of more people have been to a historic place than have been to a football game. It's one of my favorites. It really is something that people care about. And I think the World Heritage Convention, the World Heritage List at that international level, it just helps to put the flag in the ground.
So it focuses people on not building over their incredibly important sites. And when that happens, I suppose it's just such a cause of regret that we hope we'll learn lessons and not do it again.
Exactly.
Alexandra, thank you so much. I think what you've done is to put the life into what sometimes is the black letter of the conventions and so on, so understand how it works both in the UK and also internationally. Alexandra, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.